We're all aware that the uncertainty and the information on the reporting of the new Omicron variant of the COVID-19 virus has created panic around the world. The fact that South Africa has reported it only 5 days ago and the WHO has now flagged this variation of the virus and its significant mutations as a variant of concern has had everyone in a panic. As a clinician and a doctor in South Africa, I've been actively working with my peers across the country and collating information from credible sources so that we can actively share with you what has been some of the changes and observations across the country. And I think that's important so that one does not get a skewed picture of individual experiences only, but experiences across the country based on data. As of this afternoon, today being the 29th of November 2021, I've spoken to at least two of the three CEOs of the largest pathology labs in South Africa and collated some of the data that they're looking at, that they're tracking actively so, as well as sharing that information with the National Institute of Communicable Diseases in South Africa. What has been established is we're well aware, as many of you are aware already, that the variant of concern has been the flag created by the WHO because of significant concerns of transmittability, disease severity, the immune escape as it's referred to, as well as the potential risk of therapeutic escape or treatment options. Based on the information provided to me by two of the largest labs in South Africa, I've had significant consistent information and some conflicting perspectives. And I think it's important that we deliberate on this. Yes, there has been some findings of alleged increased transmittability due to the mutations of the virus. Of the 50 mutations, 30 are on the spike protein, and it is understood that it is most likely, and I say this with caution, that the variations of spike protein may increase transmittability. There's also been findings by my colleagues who say, and they infer that the S gene, which is one of the three that is being looked at primarily, has been dropped, or what is known as the S gene dropout in the testing capacity. This is being used to infer that there's an accelerated number of Omicron cases in South Africa, but it is not confirmed, because as we all know in science, correlation is not causation. The fact that on a PCR test they found that there's a dropout does not necessarily mean it is Omicron. As we all well know, the Alpha variant that was found in the United Kingdom at the early stages of the pandemic was one of the first variants identified, and that variant was identified primarily because of the S gene dropout. Yes, there are cases now during the Omicron variant that there is a amplification, if I could call it, of the other two genes that are being found. But these again are speculations to say this is most likely the Omicron variant. It's not been confirmed 100% on all the samples. I've also confirmed between these two very large labs that cover probably more than 80 to 90% of the pathology testing in South Africa, that all of their samples, 100% of their samples, are being sent to the National Institute of Communicable Diseases. And as a result of that, some of those samples, based on the mathematical models being used, are being used to completely sequence and confirm if it is definitely the Omicron variant in the samples being tested on the sampling being done by the reference lab or the National Institute in South Africa. What is important on this is, yes, we are finding the S gene being dropped on some of the outcomes of the testings. It is not prevalent across the country. There are pockets of findings, particularly in some cases in Pretoria, some cases in Johannesburg, not so much in Cape Town, Durban, and other provinces, based on some information that we have today on the 29th of November. So there is clearly a finding that there are cases, but what's important to take from that is it does not mean South Africa has an explosion of Omicron variants. There are some changes being noted, but it is not as much as information is being misinterpreted or at worst being misrepresented internationally and saying South Africa has 500% increase of the new variant, South Africa has thousands of new cases. Let's put this in context. South Africa currently has under 5,000 new cases per day, given the latest data that I've looked at this afternoon. Contrast that with the United Kingdom, that is in excess of 60 to 70,000 cases per day. The United States in excess of 30,000 cases. As a reference, South Africa has a significantly lower number of cases as we've had compared to the past, as contrasted to the rest of the world. Yes, there are these concerns of the variations, but we've not had any information as yet coming out of all of the laboratories, both private and state, in many of these states in the United Kingdom, the EU, and the US, in saying we have also monitored for the S gene dropout. No, the information that we have at this point is saying they've identified a very limited number of confirmed Omicron variants, which means there is still the potential that the S gene dropout may be identified, but not necessarily being flagged, because again, scientifically, the correlation of the S gene dropout is not a 100% confirmation scientifically that it is with 100% certainty the Omicron variant. And that has significant implications for South Africa and the rest of the world. And we have to see this in context. On the positive side, based on the information provided to me by my colleagues, one of the larger labs is not only doing the testing, but following up the admissions of the patients, their symptomatology, their disease progression, sampling with swabs sometimes every 2 or 3 days so far, based on the testing they're doing, to at least find a trend. And what has been found very positively is patients with vaccines are contracting the infection, but with very mild symptoms, which correlates to what much of my other peers have said. But when they say symptoms, they specifically say upper respiratory symptoms. So there is no major rest of the body involvement, there's no bodily pain, there's no weakness, and most importantly, there's no demand for supplemental oxygen, there's no distress or hypoxia in this context, and there's no need for oxygen support for these patients. And that's critically important, because based on the flagging by the WHO, based on the limited information we have in South Africa right now, the disease severity has not been found to be severe, and based on the information I have from the labs, the severity is actually less in the cases they found, and more importantly, the severity in patients who've already been previously vaccinated are significantly far less than those who've not been vaccinated. What is also being found is there's no dependence on oxygen or external treatments. In terms of hospital admissions, South Africa has an 11% increase in cases. Now that has to again be seen in context. 11% is a very small number if a few thousand cases are being found per day, when contrasted to the rest of the world and seen in the context of the aggressive and, in my view, unjustifiable lockdowns and restrictions of travel to various countries around the world. I appreciate the panic, but I do not appreciate the lack of the scientific basis of those decisions being made, as well as the limitations of vaccinations or vaccines being provided to South Africa and the continent of Africa at large. So to put this in context, in summarizing, there are significant findings made by the labs in South Africa. There are some observations of the S gene dropout, which may correlate with the Omicron variant, but is not necessarily a defined finding of the Omicron variant, because it is also found in the Alpha variant, which is one of the earliest variants identified in the United Kingdom. The symptomatology is far less on the patients that are being admitted, and then in terms of the patients' dependence on treatment and treatment options, the treatment options are not failing, because the patients at this early stage are not needing significant therapeutic interventions beside supportive care. And finally, a comment on transmittability. I've watched significant discussions and I've watched contributions by my peers, which I sincerely appreciate. And what I have found is when it comes to these mutations and variations, and having looked at the numbers and the changes on the S protein and the spike protein, specifically when you deal with those 30 mutations, the fact that there is a probability of increased transmittability does not translate to a large transmission of severe disease. There's also the very large possibility that because of the number of mutations on the protein and the spike protein, there may be a vulnerability or weakness of the vaccine. So the vaccine may literally, not vaccine, the virus. The virus may literally be contracted, transmit through your system, and move off with limited, if not no symptoms. These are the realities. It is early stage, we have limited information available, but based on the data that's available in South Africa, if one could call it not the epicenter, but with the aggressive surveillance and epidemiological and virological and genomic monitoring, we have information that is pointing in that direction, that some cases are being found. S protein dropouts are being found. But it could also be related to the other variants. But concretely so, even if there is an increased risk of transmittability, there so far has been very limited symptoms, very mild findings, and hence it is most likely that this new variant, given the information we have, may trend in a positive direction for all of us to reduce the risk of severe disease and mortality.